Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
When I discovered that my stepmom had been siphoning money from my late mom's charity, the one my mom had poured her heart and soul into, I thought my family would stand with me. Instead, they called me dramatic and told me to drop it. But the deeper I dug, the worse it got. After my mom passed away 6 years ago, the grief was overwhelming. But one thing that kept me grounded was her charity, a small nonprofit she'd built from the ground up to help kids in need. It wasn't just an organization, it was her life's work. Mom believed every child deserved an equal chance, and her charity provided school supplies, scholarships, and mentorship programs to make that possible. When she was alive, I saw firsthand the impact she had. Kids who had little hope of going to college were suddenly applying to universities with full scholarships. Families who couldn't afford even the basics for school started each year with backpacks full of supplies. Her charity wasn't just about helping kids, it was about giving them a future. After her death, I felt a deep responsibility to keep her vision alive. But 2 years later, my dad remarried, and my new stepmom, Laura, entered the picture. Laura was polished, charismatic, and on the surface, seemed like the perfect addition to our family. My dad praised her business acumen, saying she had a knack for organization and leadership. So when Laura offered to take over some of the charity's operations, I thought it might be a good thing. At first, things seemed to go smoothly. Laura jumped into the role with enthusiasm, holding fundraisers, coordinating events, and updating the charity's donors. She had a way of making people open their wallets, and the donations started pouring in. My dad was thrilled and often told me how lucky we were to have her. Feeling reassured, I decided to step back from the day-to-day responsibilities of the charity. I had my own life to focus on, and I trusted Laura to carry the torch. After all, she claimed she was doing it to honor my mom's legacy. But over time, things began to change. A few months ago, I noticed the charity's website hadn't been updated in over a year. That was strange because Mom had always been meticulous about keeping donors informed. She believed transparency was the key to maintaining trust, and her regular updates were a cornerstone of the charity's operations. I checked the social media accounts next. They were completely inactive, with the last post dated over a year ago. That wasn't just unusual, it was alarming. Social media was one of the main ways we connected with donors and volunteers, and neglecting it meant something wasn't right. I decided to call Laura to ask about the state of the charity. It was supposed to be a quick conversation, just me checking in to see if everything was okay. "Hey Laura," I began, keeping my tone casual. I was looking at the charity's website and noticed it hasn't been updated in a while. "Is everything all right?" There was a slight pause before she answered. "Oh, everything's fine," she said, her voice breezy. "We're just going through a transitional phase. You know how nonprofits are, things get busy, and some stuff falls through the cracks. Nothing to worry about." Her response didn't sit well with me, but I didn't push it. I figured maybe she really was overwhelmed or dealing with some behind-the-scenes challenges. Still, the whole thing left me uneasy. Over the next few weeks, I tried to get more involved again, but every time I brought it up, Laura brushed me off. "Don't worry about it," she'd say. "I've got everything under control." She even started acting annoyed, as if my questions were an inconvenience. Despite her reassurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The charity had been my mom's pride and joy, and it felt like I was letting her down by not paying closer attention. That's when I decided to dig deeper. If Laura wasn't going to tell me what was going on, I'd have to find out for myself. I didn't realize it at the time, but that decision was about to open a Pandora's box I could never close. I'll never forget the uneasy feeling I had as I walked into the charity's annual fundraiser dinner. These events used to be the highlight of the year. Big gatherings filled with donors, volunteers, and families whose lives the charity had touched. Mom would have everything perfectly planned. Speeches that brought people to tears, an auction that raised tens of thousands of dollars, and a sense of community that made everyone feel like they were part of something bigger. But this year's event was different. For starters, the room was nearly half empty. The elegant decor my mom used to obsess over was replaced with cheap tablecloths and a few scattered balloons. There were no heartfelt speeches or slideshows showcasing the kids we'd helped, just a bland presentation that felt more like an afterthought. The energy in the room was non-existent, and it felt more like a chore than a celebration. I made my way to one of the longtime volunteers, a woman named Margaret who had been with the charity since the beginning. "Hey, Margaret," I said, trying to sound casual. "The turnout's a little low this year." "Huh? What's going on?" She gave me a tight smile, the kind that screamed discomfort. "You'd have to ask Laura about that," she said, her voice clipped. I'm not as involved as I used to be. Her response surprised me. Margaret had always been deeply committed to the charity. She practically lived for it. The fact that she was stepping back wasn't just unusual. It was alarming. Determined to get answers, I sought out Laura during the event. She was standing near the bar, chatting with a couple of donors, and wearing that polished smile she always used in public. When I approached, her expression flickered for a split second, just enough for me to notice, but she quickly recovered. "Hey, Laura," I said, keeping my tone light. "Great to see you. Can we talk for a minute?" She excused herself from the donors and turned to me, her smile still plastered on. "Of course. What's up?" I gestured to the room. "The event seems smaller this year, and Margaret mentioned she's not as involved anymore. Is everything okay with the charity?" Her smile tightened, and I could see the faintest hint of annoyance in her eyes. "We're just going through a transitional phase," she said, her tone dismissive. "You know how these things are. Sometimes you have to scale back before you can grow." "That makes sense," I said slowly, though I wasn't convinced. "But the turnout's a lot lower than usual, and I noticed the website and social media haven't been updated in a while. Is there anything I can do to help?" Laura's polite facade cracked for a moment. "I've got it under control," she said, her voice sharper now. "I appreciate your concern, but there's no need to worry." I nodded, but as she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. The next morning, I started digging. If Laura wasn't going to give me straight answers, I'd find them myself. I pulled up the charity's financial reports, something my mom had always made sure to keep transparent and accessible. But what I found was unsettling. Instead of the detailed breakdowns I was used to, the reports were vague and incomplete. Categories like consulting fees and operational costs had ballooned, while the amount going to scholarships and school supplies had plummeted. Some months had no documentation at all, just a single line stating expenses covered. It didn't make sense. Mom had always insisted on clear accounting, making sure every donor knew exactly where their money was going. This was sloppy at best and suspicious at worst. I dug deeper, comparing the recent reports to older ones. The contrast was stark. Under Mom's leadership, over 80% of the funds had gone directly to the kids. Now less than 40% was being allocated to actual programs, and the rest was disappearing into administrative costs. By the time I closed my laptop, my hands were shaking. Something was very wrong, and I was determined to find out what. After finding the first few discrepancies in the charity's financial records, I couldn't let it go. My mom had poured her heart into this organization, and the thought that something might be wrong, it made my blood boil. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Laura was at the center of it. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. Every time I opened a new document, I found more red flags. Money earmarked for scholarships or school supplies had been redirected to vague categories like consulting fees, marketing expenses, and operational costs. But there were no receipts, no invoices, no actual proof that these expenses were legitimate. It was like the money had just vanished. What really caught my attention were the amounts. These weren't small oversights or rounding errors. Thousands of dollars were missing. One line item listed event coordination for a canceled fundraiser that had never even happened, costing the charity over $5,000. Another claimed transportation expenses for supplies that had never been delivered. One night, fueled by equal parts frustration and coffee, I stayed up until 2 in the morning combing through every record I could find. I compared old financial statements from when my mom was in charge to the recent ones under Laura's management. The contrast was staggering. Under my mom's leadership, everything was accounted for down to the last dollar. But now, it was a mess of half-completed reports and suspicious transactions. That's when I found it. A series of payments labeled as reimbursements, totaling nearly $15,000 over the past year. At first, I thought it might have been for legitimate expenses, but when I checked the recipient, my stomach dropped. The payments were made directly to Laura's personal bank account. The dates didn't match up with any major events, and the amounts didn't align with anything I could identify as a valid expense. There was no paperwork, no justification, just money flowing from the charity's funds into Laura's pockets. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the screen, my heart pounding. Could this really be happening? Laura had always presented herself as a dedicated leader, someone who cared about the charity's mission. But the evidence in front of me told a different story. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe there was an explanation, some kind of legitimate reason for these transactions. Maybe the financial records were incomplete, or maybe I was misinterpreting something. The next morning, I called Laura. My hands were shaking as I dialed her number, but I kept telling myself to stay calm. "Hey, Laura," I said when she picked up. "I was looking at some of the charity's financial reports, and I noticed a few payments that I had questions about. Could we meet to go over them? There was a brief pause before she answered, her tone guarded. Why are you looking at the financial reports? Her reaction caught me off guard. I just wanted to check in and make sure everything's running smoothly, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Some of the numbers don't make sense, and I thought maybe you could help clarify. I don't have time for this right now, she said, her voice tight. If you have questions, send me an email, and I'll get back to you when I can. Before I could respond, she hung up. That conversation left me more suspicious than ever. Laura had always been polite and composed, but now she sounded defensive and irritated. If there was nothing to hide, why was she so quick to shut me down? I decided it was time to confront her in person. A few days later, I showed up at her office unannounced, armed with a folder of financial documents and highlighted discrepancies. She looked surprised to see me, but quickly masked it with a strained smile. What's this about? She asked, gesturing for me to sit down. I placed a folder on her desk and opened it to the page showing the payments to her personal account. Laura, I found these transactions labeled as reimbursements. They were made directly to your account, but there's no documentation to explain what they're for. Can you help me understand? Her face hardened as she scanned the page. I don't appreciate being ambushed like this, she said sharply. If you wanted to discuss the finances, you could have scheduled a meeting. I replied, keeping my voice steady. You've been avoiding my calls, and this is important. I need to know where this money is going. She slammed the folder shut and pushed it back toward me. I've been putting in a lot of work for this charity, she said defensively. Those reimbursements are for my time and effort. Running a nonprofit isn't free, you know. Her response left me speechless. For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Laura, I said finally, this money was supposed to go to the kids. My mom's charity was about helping people, not padding someone's bank account. Do you really think this is okay? Her eyes narrowed. Your mom isn't here anymore, she said coldly. And maybe if you cared so much, you'd be more involved instead of leaving all the work to me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The person sitting in front of me wasn't the dedicated stepmom she pretended to be. She was using my mom's legacy for her own gain, and she didn't even seem sorry. As I left her office that day, I knew I couldn't let this go. Laura had crossed a line, and it was up to me to hold her accountable. My mom had trusted me to protect her legacy, and I wasn't going to let her down. I sat in Laura's office, my hands gripping the folder of financial records so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I confronted her about the payments, expecting denial, maybe an attempt to spin the story. What I didn't expect was her outright defensiveness. I've been putting in a lot of work for this charity, she snapped, crossing her arms. Those reimbursements are for my time and effort. Running a nonprofit isn't free, you know. The audacity of her response left me stunned. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. Laura, I said, my voice shaking with disbelief, this isn't your personal business. It's a charity. That money was donated to help kids. Kids who need scholarships, supplies, and opportunities. Not to fund your time and effort. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her expression hardening. You have no idea how much work goes into running this organization, she said coldly. Do you think events organize themselves? Do you think donors just hand over money without being cultivated? I've been keeping this charity alive while you've been off doing whatever it is you do. My jaw dropped. You're kidding me, right? Keeping it alive? Laura, you've practically let it fall apart. The website hasn't been updated, the scholarships have dried up, and now I find out you've been funneling money into your own account? Mom would be furious if she knew what you were doing. That's when her expression changed. The fake smile disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. Your mom isn't here anymore, she said, her voice icy. And maybe if you cared so much, you'd be more involved instead of leaving all the work to me. Her words hit like a slap. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. She was blaming me for her embezzlement, as if my decision to trust her with the charity somehow justified her behavior. You have some nerve, I finally said, my voice low and steady. Mom trusted this charity to do good in the world. She built it from nothing, and you've turned it into your personal ATM. This isn't just unethical. It's disgusting. Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. You're overreacting, she said dismissively. A small percentage of the funds have been used for operational expenses. That's completely normal for nonprofits. You clearly don't understand how these things work. I opened the folder and slid it across the desk toward her. Normal operational expenses don't include multiple payments to your personal account labeled as reimbursements. They don't include $5,000 for an event that never happened or transportation costs for supplies that were never delivered. care to explain those? For the first time, Laura's confidence faltered. She glanced at the folder, but didn't touch it. I don't have to explain myself to you, she said after a long pause. I'm the one running this charity now, not you. Her response only fueled my determination. Not for long, I said, standing up. I'm going to make sure every donor and every board member knows exactly what's been happening. This stops now. Laura's face twisted into an expression of pure disdain. You really think anyone will care? Most of the donors are casual contributors who won't bother to look beyond a few flashy events. And your dad? He'll back me up, not you. Her mention of my dad sent a chill through me. He'd always been supportive of Laura, and I wasn't naive enough to think he'd take my side without a fight. But that didn't matter. This wasn't about family politics. It was about doing the right thing. This isn't about my dad, I said firmly. And it's not about you. It's about the kids this charity was supposed to help. I'm not going to let you tarnish Mom's legacy. Laura stood up, her voice rising as she leaned across the desk. Legacy? Your mom's gone. This is my legacy now. I put in the work, and I'm not going to let you ruin everything over a few accounting discrepancies. I stared at her, incredulous. This isn't your legacy, Laura. It never was, and it never will be. It belongs to the people it was meant to help, not to you. Without waiting for her response, I turned and walked out of her office. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking, but I knew I'd done the right thing. The confrontation was just the beginning. As I left the building, I realized the fight ahead would be even harder than I'd imagined. Laura wasn't going to back down, and I'd likely face resistance from my own family. But I couldn't let that stop me. My mom's charity had helped so many people, and I owed it to her, and to the kids who depended on it, to make things right. No matter how messy things got, I was ready to fight for what was right. Laura could try to intimidate me, manipulate the narrative, and play the victim, but the truth was on my side, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. I went to my dad's house the day after my confrontation with Laura. I wanted to believe he'd understand the gravity of the situation, that he'd be as horrified as I was by what she'd done. After all, this was Mom's charity, her legacy. There was no way he'd stand by while Laura tore it apart for her own gain, or so I thought. I sat down with him in the living room, folder in hand. My dad, always the picture of calm, leaned back in his recliner with a mug of coffee. You look serious, he said. What's going on? I took a deep breath and opened the folder, laying the documents on the coffee table between us. Dad, I need to talk to you about Laura and the charity. I've been going through the financial records, and something's not right. He frowned, leaning forward to glance at the papers. What do you mean? I pointed to the highlighted transactions. These payments, labeled as reimbursements, are going directly to Laura's personal account. Thousands of dollars, and there's no documentation to back them up. And look at this. $5,000 for a canceled event and expenses for supplies that were never delivered. The money's not going where it's supposed to, Dad. Laura's been taking it. His reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of outrage or concern, his expression darkened with frustration. I don't know what you're trying to say here, he said, his tone defensive. I'm saying she's stealing from the charity, I replied, my voice rising. Mom's charity. She's taking money that's supposed to go to kids and using it for herself. Dad shook his head, his jaw tightening. Laura's done so much for this family and the charity. Do you have any idea how hard she's worked to keep it afloat? Maybe instead of tearing her down, you should be grateful. Grateful? I repeated, stunned. Dad, she's embezzling funds. This isn't about hard work. It's about her using Mom's legacy for her own personal gain. How can you be okay with that? He stood up, his voice rising to match mine. I'm not okay with you coming in here and accusing her without proof. You think running a nonprofit is easy? Maybe if you'd been more involved, you'd understand how much effort it takes to keep it going. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Dad, I do have proof. It's all right here in these records. I'm not making this up. But he refused to look at the documents again. This is just a misunderstanding, he said dismissively. Laura wouldn't do something like that. She cares about this family, and she's done nothing but try to keep the charity alive for your mother's sake. My heart sank as I realized I wasn't going to get through to him. Dad, if you can't see what's happening here, then you're just as blind as everyone else she's fooled. His face hardened. Watch your tone, he said sharply. Laura's your stepmother, and she's part of this family now. If you can't respect that, maybe you should take a step back. I stood there, stunned into silence. He wasn't just dismissing me. He was choosing Laura over me, over Mom's legacy. It was like a betrayal I hadn't even known was possible. Things got worse when my step-siblings found out about my accusations. Laura, of course, spun the story in her favor, painting herself as the victim of my unfair scrutiny. "You're being selfish," my stepsister, Ashley, said during a family dinner. "Do you even know how hard Mom works for this charity? She's been putting in so much effort, and all you're doing is tearing her down." "She's not your mom," I snapped before I could stop myself. Ashley's face flushed with anger. "She's done more for this family than you have. You don't even care about the charity. You just want to play the hero because it makes you feel important." "That's not true," I shot back. "I care about the charity because it was my mom's life's work. And if you actually looked at the evidence, you'd see what's really going on." My stepbrother, James, chimed in, his tone dripping with disdain. "Maybe if you spent less time digging through papers and more time helping, things wouldn't be such a mess." I looked around the table, feeling completely outnumbered. My dad sat silently, not even attempting to mediate. It was clear he wasn't going to back me up. After that dinner, I realized I was fighting an uphill battle. Laura had everyone wrapped around her finger, and no one wanted to believe she was capable of doing something so terrible. To them, I was the troublemaker, the ungrateful child who couldn't appreciate all the hard work Laura had put into the charity. But I wasn't going to let their denial stop me. This wasn't just about me or my family. It was about doing the right thing. Mom's charity had helped so many people, and I couldn't let Laura destroy it. If my family wouldn't listen, I'd have to find another way to expose the truth. No matter how much backlash I faced, I knew I couldn't give up. Mom's legacy was worth fighting for, even if it meant standing alone. The backlash from my family was tough to handle, but the idea of giving up never crossed my mind. Every time I thought about letting it go, I pictured my mom, her smile when she handed a scholarship to a student, her tireless efforts to make every event meaningful. I knew I owed it to her to see this through, no matter how much resistance I faced. The first thing I did was contact a lawyer. I explained the situation in detail, showing them the financial discrepancies I'd uncovered. "If this is true," the lawyer said, flipping through the documents, "it's a clear case of embezzlement. But to take action, we'll need more than this. You'll need an official investigation." It was daunting, but I was determined. I reached out to some of the charity's original donors, people who had supported my mom from the beginning. To my surprise, many of them had already noticed something was wrong. "We haven't heard from the charity in months," one donor said. I assumed they were struggling, but if what you're saying is true, this is a betrayal of everything your mom stood for. With the donor support, I filed a formal complaint with the state's nonprofit oversight board. The process was grueling, requiring endless paperwork, evidence submissions, and interviews. Every step felt like a battle, but knowing I wasn't alone gave me strength. The oversight board assigned a team of auditors to investigate the charity's finances. They went through every record, every transaction, and every email. It took weeks, and during that time, I kept a low profile. Laura was still running the day-to-day operations, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. When the auditors finally completed their work, the findings were damning. Laura had embezzled tens of thousands of dollars over the past 2 years. She'd labeled her personal expenses as operational costs and reimbursements, funneling money from the charity into her own bank account. The breakdown was jaw-dropping. She'd used charity funds to pay for luxury vacations, designer shopping sprees, and even renovations to her house. One report listed a $5,000 expense for event decorations that turned out to be a custom chandelier for her dining room. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through the donor community. Many of the people who had trusted the charity with their money were furious, not just at Laura, but at the entire organization for letting it happen. I'll never forget the day I sat down with the auditors to review their findings. The lead investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Karen, slid the final report across the table. "This is one of the most blatant cases of nonprofit fraud I've seen in years," she said. "You did the right thing by bringing this to our attention." Hearing those words felt like validation for everything I'd endured. But I knew the fight wasn't over yet. The investigation had exposed the truth, but now I had to figure out what to do with it. Laura, of course, denied everything when confronted by the board. She claimed the expenses were legitimate and insisted that the auditors had misunderstood the records. "This is a witch hunt," she said during one of the hearings. "I've done nothing but work tirelessly for this charity. These accusations are baseless." But the evidence was irrefutable. The board voted unanimously to remove her from her position, and she was ordered to repay the stolen funds. The fallout was messy. My dad was livid, not at Laura, but at me. "You've destroyed this family," he said during one of our arguments. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Dad," I said, my voice trembling with frustration. Laura did this to herself. She stole from Mom's charity. How can you defend her after everything that's come to light? But he wouldn't listen to him. I was the villain who had torn the family apart. My step-siblings refused to speak to me, blaming me for ruining Laura's reputation. It was isolating, but I kept reminding myself of why I'd started this fight in the first place. The donors rallied behind me, offering their support as I worked to rebuild the charity. Many of them expressed relief that Laura was gone, though some admitted they were hesitant to trust the organization again. It was a bittersweet victory. I'd uncovered the truth and held Laura accountable, but it came at a cost. My family's support was gone, and the charity's reputation was in shambles. Still, I knew I'd done the right thing. As I sat in the now-empty office, reviewing plans to move forward, I felt a glimmer of hope. The charity had been through hell, but it wasn't dead. With hard work and dedication, I knew I could honor my mom's legacy and rebuild what Laura had tried to destroy. The investigation's conclusion didn't come with any celebratory fanfare. When Laura was officially removed from her role in the charity, I should have felt a sense of victory. But all I could feel was exhaustion. The damage she had done to the organization, financially, morally, and reputationally, hung over me like a dark cloud. Laura had been ordered to repay the stolen funds, though everyone knew it would take years, if not decades, for her to make good on it. The board members voted unanimously to remove her, and her name was wiped from every association with the charity. Donors were notified of the investigation's findings, and a public statement was released to address the scandal. But no amount of transparency could undo the harm to the charity's reputation. Word spread quickly, and it wasn't long before the local news picked up the story. Headlines like "Stepmother Caught Embezzling from Local Charity" and "Nonprofit in Peril After Financial Scandal" dominated the community grapevine. I kept my head down, avoiding the media and trying to focus on damage control. But every time I saw my mom's name mentioned in connection with the fallout, it felt like a punch to the gut. The hardest part of it all was my dad. I'd expected some resistance from him when this all started, but I never imagined the level of anger and betrayal he directed at me. "You've destroyed this family," he said one evening when I tried to visit him. His voice was cold, and his words hit harder than I anticipated. "Dad," I began, trying to stay calm. "Laura was stealing from the charity. From Mom's charity. What did you expect me to do? Just look the other way?" "I expected you to think about the bigger picture," he snapped. "Do you have any idea what you've done to Laura? To this family? She's humiliated, and we're all suffering because of it. All because you couldn't let things go." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Let it go," I repeated, my voice trembling with disbelief. "Dad, she embezzled tens of thousands of dollars. She betrayed Mom's legacy, and you're angry at me for exposing it?" He didn't respond, just shook his head like he couldn't bear to look at me. "You should have handled this differently," he said finally. "You could have talked to her, worked it out as a family. But instead, you brought in lawyers and turned it into a spectacle." Those words haunted me. No matter how many times I told myself I'd done the right thing, the weight of my dad's disappointment felt unbearable. And he wasn't the only one. My step-siblings cut me off entirely, refusing to take my calls or respond to my messages. In their eyes, I wasn't just the person who'd exposed Laura. I was the one who had ruined their family. At one point, my stepsister Ashley sent me a text that simply read, "Hope you're happy. You got what you wanted." Even friends and acquaintances who knew about the situation seemed to have mixed feelings. Some people commended me for standing up for what was right, but others whispered that I'd gone too far, that I'd dragged the family name through the mud. Despite all this, I couldn't bring myself to regret my decision. My mom's legacy wasn't just about helping kids. It was about integrity, about doing the right thing even when it was hard. Laura had turned that legacy into a tool for her own greed, and I couldn't stand by and let that happen. The fallout from the scandal wasn't limited to my personal life. The charity itself was in shambles. Donors were hesitant to contribute after the news broke, worried their money wouldn't be used responsibly. Several longtime volunteers resigned, saying they couldn't handle the stress of the public scrutiny. I worked tirelessly to pick up the pieces, attending meeting after meeting with the remaining board members and trying to reassure donors that the charity was under new management. We put new financial controls in place, increased transparency, and launched a small fundraiser to regain trust. But progress was slow. One night, as I sat in the office surrounded by paperwork, I found myself staring at a photo of my mom. It was taken at one of the charity's earliest events, back when it was just starting to gain traction. She was handing a backpack to a little boy, her smile radiant. "I'm sorry, Mom," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. I try to protect what you built, but it feels like I've made everything worse. But even as the doubt crept in, I reminded myself of why I'd started this fight in the first place. My mom wouldn't have backed down in the face of adversity, and neither could I. Over the next few weeks, I focused on rebuilding, not just the charity, but my sense of purpose. I reached out to community leaders, organized a series of small events to re-engage donors, and began planning a scholarship program to help rebuild trust. It wasn't easy. Every day felt like an uphill battle, and the lingering resentment from my family made it even harder. But I knew I was doing the right thing. Mom's legacy deserved better than to be tarnished by greed and deceit. And even though it came at a cost, I knew in my heart that standing up for her was worth it. As I worked late into the night, drafting a plan for the charity's future, I felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was long, but I wasn't giving up. My mom wouldn't have, and neither would I. When the dust settled after the investigation, and Laura was officially removed, the reality of what lay ahead hit me like a freight train. The charity was in shambles. Donations had dried up. Our reputation was in tatters, and the once dedicated volunteer team had scattered, disheartened by the scandal. It felt like I was standing in the middle of a battlefield, surrounded by the ruins of something my mom had worked so hard to build. But I couldn't let it end there. Not after everything I'd fought for. The first step was reaching out to the remaining board members to form a recovery plan. We held our first meeting in the charity's cramped office, a far cry from the bustling hub it had once been. Only 3 members showed up, down from the dozen or so who had been active when my mom was in charge. They were hesitant, even wary, but they were willing to listen. We've lost a lot, I admitted during that meeting, but I believe we can rebuild. We owe it to the kids this charity was meant to help. And to my mom's legacy. They nodded, though their expressions were cautious. One board member, an older man named Greg, who had been with the charity since the beginning, spoke up. Rebuilding trust will be the hardest part, he said. People don't forget scandals like this overnight. I know, I replied. But if we start small, focus on transparency, and remind people why this charity exists, I think we can earn their trust back. The first order of business was addressing the finances. I worked with the remaining board members to implement new safeguards, including an external audit system and stricter guidelines for spending. Every dollar had to be accounted for, and every decision had to be approved collectively. Next, I reached out to donors, both past and potential. It wasn't easy. Many of them were understandably hesitant, and some outright refused to return. I loved what your mom did for the community, one former donor said, but after what happened, I don't know if I can trust the organization again. I didn't argue with them. Instead, I focused on showing them the changes we'd made and inviting them to small, intimate events where they could see our work firsthand. We hosted a back-to-school drive, pooling funds from a handful of loyal supporters to distribute backpacks and supplies to local kids. It wasn't as big as the events we used to hold, but it was a start. The look on those kids' faces when they received their backpacks reminded me why I was doing this. It wasn't about the scandal or the family drama. It was about them. Rebuilding the volunteer base was another uphill battle. Many of the longtime volunteers had quit during the scandal, and finding new ones was tough. People didn't want to be associated with a charity that had been in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. I decided to focus on young, passionate individuals who were eager to make a difference. I reached out to local colleges and high schools, speaking to community service clubs and posting flyers about volunteer opportunities. Slowly but surely, we began to see new faces. One of the most rewarding moments came during a scholarship event we managed to hold a few months later. For the first time since the scandal, we awarded scholarships to 3 deserving students. It wasn't the 10 or 12 we used to award, but it was something. As I handed out the certificates, I couldn't help but think of my mom and how proud she would have been. I just want to say thank you, one of the students said, her voice trembling with emotion. This scholarship means everything to me and my family. I promise I won't waste this opportunity. Hearing those words reminded me why this fight was worth it. In the midst of all this, I found myself reflecting on my own priorities. For years, I had treated the charity as something separate from me, a part of my mom's life, not mine. But as I threw myself into the work, I realized how much it meant to me personally. This wasn't just about honoring my mom anymore. It was about continuing her vision and making it my own. I found myself spending long hours in the office, brainstorming ways to expand our programs and reach more kids. I even started attending nonprofit management workshops to improve my leadership skills. The more I invested in the charity, the more I felt connected to my mom's memory. It was like she was with me every step of the way, guiding me through the challenges and reminding me of the values she had instilled in me. It was a long, difficult road, but eventually the charity began to thrive again. The donations started trickling back in, and we were able to expand our scholarship program and provide supplies to more kids than ever before. 1 year after Laura's removal, we held our first large-scale fundraiser, a gala in honor of my mom's legacy. The room was filled with donors, volunteers, and families who had been impacted by the charity's work. As I stood on stage to give the opening speech, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride and gratitude. This charity has faced challenges, I said, my voice steady, but its mission has never changed. We're here to make a difference, to give kids the tools they need to succeed, and to honor the legacy of someone who believed in the power of community. Thank you for standing with us. The applause that followed was thunderous, and for the first time in years, I felt like the charity and my mom's legacy was truly alive again. As the charity began to rebuild, I couldn't ignore the glaring void in my personal life. My relationship with my family, particularly my dad, was fractured in a way that felt almost irreparable. He wasn't speaking to me unless absolutely necessary, and when he did, his tone was distant and clipped. My step-siblings, Ashley and James, had outright blocked me on social media and ignored my calls. At first, I tried to rationalize it. The scandal had been hard on everyone, and emotions were running high. Maybe they just needed time to process everything. But as weeks turned into months, it became clear that they weren't interested in reconciliation. In their eyes, I wasn't the person who exposed Laura's wrongdoing. I was the one who had destroyed the family. The most painful part was my dad. He had always been my rock growing up, the one I turned to for advice or reassurance. But now, it felt like I didn't recognize him. One afternoon, I decided to try reaching out again. I called him and asked if we could meet for coffee, hoping that a neutral setting might make things easier. To my surprise, he agreed. When we met, he looked tired, older, somehow. Then I remembered. We exchanged pleasantries, but the tension between us was palpable. Finally, I decided to address the elephant in the room. Dad, I began cautiously. I know things have been difficult lately, but I want to make things right between us. He set his coffee cup down and sighed heavily. I don't know if that's possible, he said. You've caused a lot of damage, and I'm not sure how we come back from that. I felt a pang of frustration. Dad, I wasn't the one who caused the damage. Laura stole from Mom's charity. All I did was expose the truth. But at what cost? He countered, his voice rising slightly. You didn't just expose Laura. You dragged this family's name through the mud. Do you know how embarrassing it's been for us? The whispers, the stares. People think we're all corrupt because of what you did. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What I did? I repeated, my voice trembling. Dad, Laura was the one who embezzled money, not me. She betrayed Mom's legacy, and you're blaming me for holding her accountable? You could have handled it differently, he said, his tone flat. You didn't have to make it public. You could have come to me, and we could have dealt with it as a family. We tried that, remember? I shot back, and you dismissed me. You called me ungrateful and told me to let it go. What else was I supposed to do? He didn't answer, just stared down at his coffee. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument we'd had. After that meeting, I stopped trying to reach out. I realized that no matter how much I wanted to repair our relationship, it wasn't something I could do on my own. My dad wasn't ready to acknowledge what had happened or the role he'd played in enabling Laura. And until he was, there was nothing more I could say. The rift extended to my step-siblings as well. Ashley and James refused to acknowledge my existence, and any family gatherings were tense and awkward. They saw me as the villain, the person who had taken away their mom's reputation and security. At first, I tried to explain my side of the story to them, but it was like talking to a wall. You don't understand what you've done to her, Ashley said during one particularly heated exchange. She was just trying to help the family, and you destroyed her. She destroyed herself, I replied, my voice firm. All I did was reveal the truth. If you can't see that, then I don't know what to tell you. From that point on, they stopped engaging with me entirely. It hurt a lot. Losing my family, especially my dad, felt like a piece of my heart had been ripped out. But over time, I began to accept that not every relationship can be saved. Sometimes, doing the right thing comes with a cost. And in this case, that cost was my connection to the people who should have supported me the most. Instead of dwelling on what I'd lost, I focused on the people who stood by me. My friends became my lifeline, offering support and encouragement when I needed it most. The donors and volunteers who had returned to the charity gave me a sense of purpose, reminding me that the work I was doing mattered. Most importantly, I focused on the kids. Every scholarship we awarded and every backpack we handed out felt like a small victory, a way of proving that the charity could overcome the scandal and continue making a difference. In the end, I realized that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who stand by you, who believe in you, and who share your values. And while I still held out hope that my dad and I might reconcile one day, I knew that for now, I had to move forward without him. Mom had always taught me to do what was right, even when it was hard, and though it had cost me more than I ever imagined, I knew she would have been proud of me for standing my ground. The aftermath of the scandal left deep scars, but as time passed, those wounds began to heal. Looking back, I know I made the right decision, even if it came at a high cost. Exposing Laura's embezzlement wasn't just about the money. It was about preserving my mom's legacy, the work she poured her heart into, and the kids whose futures depended on it. There were moments when I doubted myself, when the weight of my family's estrangement felt too heavy to bear. But each time, I reminded myself why I'd taken this stand. It wasn't just about what my mom would have wanted, it was about what was right. Now the charity is thriving. It didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy, but the pieces slowly came back together. Donors who had initially pulled away began to return, drawn by the renewed sense of transparency and purpose. Volunteers, both old and new, came together with a shared commitment to making a difference. One of the most rewarding moments came during our annual scholarship ceremony last month. Standing on stage, I looked out at the crowd of families, donors, and supporters who had stuck with us through everything. For the first time in years, the room was filled with the same energy and excitement I remembered from when my mom was in charge. As I handed a scholarship to a young girl named Lila, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "This means everything to me and my family. I promise I'll make the most of it." Hearing those words reminded me of why the fight was worth it. It wasn't about proving a point or winning an argument. It was about giving kids like Lila a chance at a brighter future. After the ceremony, I took a moment to stand in the corner of the room, watching as people mingled and shared stories. There was laughter, hope, and a sense of community that I hadn't felt in years. In that moment, I felt a deep sense of pride, not just in what the charity had accomplished, but in myself for standing my ground. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I've come to understand that family isn't always about blood. It's about the people who stand by you when it matters most, the ones who believe in you even when the odds are against you. While I wish things had turned out differently with my dad and step-siblings, I've learned to accept that some relationships can't be mended. It still hurts sometimes, but I've stopped blaming myself. I did what I had to do, not just for my mom's legacy, but for the kids who depended on the charity's work. I've also learned to surround myself with people who share my values, friends, donors, and volunteers who inspire me every day. They've become my chosen family, a network of support and encouragement that has helped me through the toughest times. As I look toward the future, I'm filled with a sense of hope. The charity is expanding its programs, reaching more kids than ever before, and planning new initiatives to help underserved communities. Every time I see the impact we're making, I feel a surge of pride, knowing that my mom's vision is alive and thriving. If she were here, I think she'd be proud too, not just of the charity, but of me. She always taught me to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, and to never let fear or doubt hold me back. The road hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. Moving forward, I'm more determined than ever to honor my mom's memory and make a difference in the lives of the kids she cared about so deeply. Her legacy lives on, and so does her spirit. And for that, I'll always be grateful.